Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I'm over 60 years old and the press has been hysterical about something or other just about every single day of my life. One of their favorite topics of hysteria this week has been Arctic sea ice. The Guardian says, Arctic sea ice cover falls to alarming low as temperatures rise. It was a bit surprising for me to see this headline right now because it's midwinter in the Arctic. It doesn't seem very likely that Arctic sea ice cover is falling at the present time. Next, the article said, change affects more than 70 indigenous communities around the Bering Sea. So by throwing in the word indigenous, they instantly make it a social justice issue. Then they say, Arctic sea ice cover fell to its second lowest level on record this summer, continuing a dramatic downwards trend that is disrupting marine ecosystems and making life for indigenous peoples in the region ever more precarious. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration NOAA annual report card on the state of the Arctic found that the average annual air temperature was 1.9 degrees Celsius above the long-term average. Taken from 1981 to 2010, the second highest it has been since observational records began in 1900. Wow, that sounds really bad. Let's take a look at the sea ice data and see if we can find that dramatic downwards trend which the Guardian is referring to. This graph plots Arctic sea ice extent in blue for every day going back to the start of 2006. This data is from the Multi-Agency Sea Ice Index, whose database begins on January 1, 2006. The red line shows the 365-day average of Arctic sea ice extent. You can see a very cyclical pattern in the data. During winter, the ice extent increases, and during summer it decreases. It does the same pattern every year. But the long-term trend, shown in red, is close to zero. The Guardian said there's been a dramatic decline in recent years, but that simply isn't true. There's no indication of any meaningful trend in Arctic sea ice extent over the past 13 years. This map from the National Snow and Ice Data Center shows Arctic sea ice extent this week. You can see that the ice edge is very close to the 1981 to 2010 median, shown in orange. There isn't anything in the least bit alarming or unusual about this map. This next graph of Arctic sea ice extent is from the Danish Meteorological Institute. There's nothing alarming in this graph either. The ice extent for this year is shown in black, and then for the last month it's shown in red. You can see that ice extent this year is tracked pretty closely to all the other recent years. The claimed second lowest on record is based on a little tiny dip which the ice took for a few days in the middle of September. And here's an article from Alaska Public Radio. Chukchi sea ice coverage reaches record low. I made this animation of Arctic sea ice from mid-May through mid-June so we can see exactly what happened in the Chukchi Sea this year. This is Alaska, this is the Chukchi Sea, and this is the Beaufort Sea. If you watch the animation, you can see that a lot of open water appeared in the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea starting in the middle of May. What was happening is that winds were pushing the ice edge offshore and they were forcing it over towards the Russia side of the Arctic. So the ice wasn't actually melting, it was just getting pushed offshore by the wind and then compressed over on the other side of the Arctic. This graph shows temperatures near the North Pole since the start of the year. I have May temperatures highlighted in pink. The blue line is the freezing mark. You can see that May temperatures were well below freezing. So that ice that was getting pushed offshore in Alaska wasn't actually melting. So this global warming hysteria about the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas was actually just some unusual winds which occurred early in the summer. If we go back and look at the extent graph again, we can see what all the Arctic minimums were in each of the past 13 years. You can see that this year was slightly lower than 2007 and 2008. Not really something to get too upset about, unless you're a climate alarmist with way too much excess time on your hands. Now we're going to look at the next paragraph of the Guardian article. They have a graph showing sea ice extent since the year 1978, and at the bottom they explain, the warmer conditions meant that the ice froze later in the winter and melted sooner in the summer, reducing the extent of Arctic ice at the end of summer to the second lowest level since satellites began monitoring ice coverage 41 years ago. Let's read the end of that paragraph again. They say satellites began monitoring ice coverage 41 years ago. But that claim simply is not true. This is a screenshot from Chapter 7 of the 1990 IPCC report. It said satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. And at the bottom is a very important phrase. It says, in 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. So now we can see a couple of major deceptions going on with the Guardian article and the NOAA graph. NOAA claims they don't have Arctic satellite sea ice data prior to 41 years ago, when in fact the IPCC report says that they do. And it's also clear why they're hiding it from us. It's because ice extent prior to the year 1978 was much lower. NOAA wants to show a downward trend caused by carbon dioxide rather than the actual cyclical behavior of the Arctic ice, which they don't want people to know about. Now let's take a look at the Arctic sea ice graph from the 1990 IPCC report. I'm going to place a red circle showing where NOAA starts their current sea ice graph, right at the peak. And what they're doing is they're hiding all of the low sea ice extent which occurred earlier in the 1970s. And this allows them to fool people into believing that the cyclical decline after 1978 was caused by carbon dioxide rather than natural cycles which repeat over and over again in the Arctic. In this graph I highlighted in pink all of the missing satellite data which NOAA now claims they don't have. It is ridiculous to pretend that we don't have Arctic sea ice satellite data prior to 1979, when in fact we traveled to the moon a decade earlier. Apollo astronauts, many of whom are climate skeptics, took this photograph of Antarctica during the 1960s. As I always like to point out, climate alarmism is dependent on an ignorance of history. Now let's take a look at the history of Arctic sea ice going back much further than the 1970s. This graph is from the 1985 DOE report, which was the predecessor to the IPCC. You can see that 100 years ago Arctic sea ice extent was pretty high, and then it dropped sharply until the mid-1950s, and then it started to rise back up again. In this next chart I combined the 1985 DOE graph with the 1990 IPCC graph. The red circle shows where the current NOAA graph begins, the one which was printed in the Guardian article. You can see exactly what they're up to. They cherry-pick the start point of their current graph as being the highest ice extent of the past century. In doing so, they can defraud the public into believing there's a linear downwards trend instead of just normal cyclical behavior which repeats over and over again. Then after cherry-picking their start date, they can get the useful idiots in the press to say things like, the extent of Arctic sea ice has fallen dramatically in recent years. Now we're going to take a look at some of the ice-free Arctic predictions made by climate scientists and by the press. Here's a good one from 2008. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Representative Ed Markey, Massachusetts committee chairman, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later we recognize him as a climate prophet. 12 years ago this week, Nobel laureate Al Gore warned that the Arctic could be ice-free by the year 2014.
Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now. In the last few months, it has been harder and harder to misinterpret the signs that our world is spinning out of kilter.
According to experts, the Arctic was supposed to be ice-free a long time ago. Now I'm going to annotate on the graph some of the failed ice-free Arctic projections made by climate scientists and the press. In 2008, Norway's leading Arctic expert predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free that summer. National Geographic also predicted that the North Pole would be ice-free in 2008. Based on the absurd predictions of climate scientists, British swimmer Lewis Pugh tried to kayak to the North Pole. He didn't make it very far. Here's another prediction by NASA's Jay Zwally that the Arctic will be ice-free by the year 2012. And Mark Cerise from the National Snow and Ice Data Center said, the Arctic is screaming. Same story in National Geographic, 2007, Arctic sea ice gone in summer within 5 years. BBC, Arctic summer is ice-free by 2013. Sierra Club, Arctic sea ice will vanish in 2013. Al Gore in USA Today predicted the Arctic would be ice-free in the summer of 2014. The Guardian predicted the Arctic would be ice-free in 2015 and cause a methane catastrophe. Journalist Mark Hartsgaard also warned that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015. The Guardian forecast for an ice-free Arctic and methane catastrophe in 2015 didn't work out too well for them, so they pushed the dates back to 2017 or 2018. And then, of course, the world's leading climate expert, James Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said the Arctic would be ice-free no later than 2018. The worst forecast of all was made by President Obama's science advisor John Holdren in 2009. He said, if you lose the summer sea ice, there are phenomena that could lead you not so very long thereafter to lose the winter sea ice as well. And if you lose that sea ice year-round, it's going to mean drastic climate change all over the hemisphere. It isn't clear to me how he expected the North Pole to remain ice-free when there's no sunlight up there for 6 months from September through March. He must have been using the standard climate alarmist math. All these experts had absolutely no clue what they were talking about, but the Arctic actually was ice-free 6,000 to 7,000 years ago when carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were very low. It should be fairly obvious by now that Arctic sea ice extent and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have very little, if anything, to do with each other. Now let's look at some history. In 1923, it was reported that the North Pole was melting and many glaciers had vanished. Is the North Pole going to melt entirely? Are the Arctic regions warming up with the prospect of a great climatic change in that part of the world? Science is asking these questions. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas around Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions, with hitherto unheard of high temperatures on that part of the Earth's surface. And remember, this was almost 100 years ago. Also in 1923, experts predicted that Glacier National Park in Montana would be ice-free within 25 years. That would have been 1948. It's pretty clear from these articles that the Arctic was very warm in 1923 and that glaciers were melting. 1930, New York Times. Word comes from Switzerland that the Alpine glaciers are in full retreat. In 1932, it was reported that the Ross ice shelf in West Antarctica had already retreated 30 miles, and that the retreat may have been going on for centuries during pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide. Again in 1936, experts predicted that Glacier National Park would be ice-free within 25 years. That would be 1961, the year Barack Obama was born. It was reported by scientists in 1939 that since 1910, Arctic winter temperatures had increased by 16 degrees. Also in 1939, it was reported that all the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, and that those glaciers, like the ones in Norway, face the possibility of catastrophic collapse. In 1947, it was reported by scientists that the Arctic ice cap was melting very quickly. At the same rate as they are at present melting, oceanic surfaces would rise to catastrophic proportions, and people living in the lowlands along the shores would be inundated. Dr. Allman added that temperatures in the Arctic have increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. And in 1958, the New York Times reported the polar ice cap was 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. But things changed quickly over the next few years, and by 1961 there was unanimous agreement among scientists that Earth was getting colder. In 1970, the New York Times reported, U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. In 1975, the Chicago Tribune said, "Brr, new ice age on way soon." In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. So it should be pretty clear now why NOAA and The Guardian don't want you to know what was going on prior to the year 1978. But unlike climate alarmists, I'm an actual scientist and I do want to know. The blue line shows temperatures at Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, going back to the year 1900. You can see that it's very cyclical behavior. You can also see that temperatures in the 1940s were at least as warm as they have been in recent years. The coldest year on record in Iceland was 1979, which not coincidentally is also the year which NOAA starts their Arctic sea ice graph. If you want to make it look like the Arctic is melting, of course you want to start at the coldest year on record. What NOAA and The Guardian are doing here is not science, it's just plain fraud. But we are doing science, so in red I plotted on top of the Reykjavik temperatures the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO. The AMO is an ocean circulation pattern, and as you can see, there's a very close correlation between the AMO and Reykjavik temperatures. There's little or no correlation between Arctic sea ice extent and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, but there is very good correlation with the AMO. If government climate scientists were actual scientists, they would want the public to know about this. But instead, they simply hide the data before 1979. Climate scientists say they can fix the climate and prevent bad weather if we simply give them large amounts of money. They always say that they have a solution. In 1975, climatologists said we were headed into a new ice age, and one of the solutions they proposed was to melt the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. Climatologists no longer want to pollute the Arctic with soot. Now they simply want to pollute the stratosphere with cheap chemicals in order to stop global warming. It's almost like these people are mad scientists. There is nothing unusual going on with the climate, and one of the best things we could do for the Earth would be to stop listening to climate alarmists and definitely stop giving them money. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.